This is Moments of Truth, the webcast with and for customer success professionals. I'm your host, Andrew Marks, co-founder of Success Hacker and the Success Coaching Training Program. And today I'm joined by Karla Kannan, Senior Vice President of Customer Success at Birch Street Systems, a procure-to-pay SaaS platform focused on the hospitality industry. Karla is originally from Mexico and now resides in Miami, Florida. She holds a bachelor's in marketing and management and a master's in training and development from Roosevelt University. Karla, welcome to the program and thanks for making time for me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
From our prep call, we identified a couple of topics to discuss today: stakeholder mapping and development of a governance body to drive change. Now, both topics stand up pretty well on their own, but they're related. And so I wanted to start with stakeholder mapping, if you don't mind. So before getting into the why and the how, what is a stakeholder?
Absolutely. Very important to define that. The Project Management Institute defines a stakeholder as any individual or organization that are actively involved in the project, or that they have a positive or negative effect as a result of the project execution or the completion of the project. Now, stakeholder is a very broad term, and different people are viewed as stakeholders. That doesn't mean that everyone is a stakeholder that has the same impact into a project, because stakeholders could include employees, customers, suppliers, and so much more. So we have, for the purposes of this discussion, defined primary stakeholders and secondary. I'm going to focus more on the primary stakeholders, because the primary stakeholders are those that have a financial stake and they contribute to the success of the project. We think about, your end users, your customers. Not every single stakeholder, even if it's primary, is going to have the same amount of influence over the decisions that are made by the organization. So again, I want to focus for the discussion on the primary stakeholders. You do have the secondary. These are external parties that are outside of the organizations. For example, your auditors, state or local government. They do have an influence on a specific outcome. They do it either by pressure or suggestions, but they really don't have any investment in the business financially. So for our purposes, for example, statutory requirements are very important. However, they do not guide the decision of the customer. They influence the decision, but they do not guide it. So I just wanted to have that definition there. We'll be focusing on primary stakeholders.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you may need to implement a solution that a statutory requirement mandates, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can influence how you roll it out or which solution you choose, just the fact that you have one.
Exactly. It's typically a question on your RFP, but it's not necessarily the defining factor to tell us if there is success.
Now, for the primary stakeholders that have a financial stake, and they have a different type of influence, but you can have people with varying levels of influence that would be considered primary stakeholders. Absolutely.
I think many times we tend to think that we have to convince or to influence one individual that is attached to the project, and it might not be the right resource. Yeah, you might be, like they say, barking at the wrong door, right? Because that person might not be able to influence the decision. It might be somebody that is your counterpart on the customer side, but not necessarily the one that is going to help you propel the project forward.
And at the same time, you could have a key stakeholder, somebody whose budget this solution comes out of, that may not be the most ideal person to spend your time influencing, because what they're doing is they're listening to their boots on the ground end users. And while they may not have direct influence over whether you move forward or not with a vendor, they have a voice.
Absolutely. And a lot of that has to do with that analysis that you do on defining who is the right stakeholder and how do you approach and manage them.
Okay, so that's a nice segue into why is stakeholder mapping so important in the world of customer success?
Absolutely. Stakeholder mapping allows us to understand the level of engagement that we require from the resources that are working with you on delivering a particular project or outcome. It doesn't restrict that there might be other people in the purview. Sometimes you can have very large onboarding projects or very large initiatives that include a set of stakeholders, but that doesn't mean that each of them is going to play a role in this initiative. One of the things that I like to do is identify work streams, because if you have a very large project, the engagement that you need from the entire pool that are attached to your customer might vary depending on what response you need from them. So I like to create work streams, because if I identify that, for example, we have a work stream that is related to finance decisions, the end user that deals with procurement might need to be consulted, but not necessarily be the person that is going to be responsible for the outcome, or that should be necessarily a big player into that initiative. As a whole, you could have so many people involved in a project, but you have to understand what role do they play in that particular relationship, and at what level you need to have them. Sometimes, in my experience, we tend to go to the person that signed the contract. And we believe that that person is the one that has the biggest influence. And just like you mentioned, moments ago, that person might not really care as much. They might want to be informed, perhaps consulted, but they don't want to get into the details. They just hear from the field. So who are they hearing from that you need to influence in the entire project, in the entire outcome that you are delivering? So I like to think about it as a quadrant, right? You have people that have power, and then you have people that have interest. And thinking about that quadrant, there might be people that have a lot of power, but they have very little interest. And then some people that have less power and they have more interest. And you have to figure out, where do they fit?
You not only need to figure out where they fit, but the ones that have little power but a lot of interest, you also need to figure out, okay, well, how loud is their voice?
Oh, very loud.
Yeah.
Very loud. And if you have at some point in a project dealt with change management, there is also something called resistance management. And that's where it comes, where you have people that have less power, but a lot of interest, and therefore a lot of influence. And those people can actually deter the objectives of your project, because they will be very vocal around what they perceive to be their needs against the outcomes that you're delivering.
Yeah, that's something I used to do in my days working for enterprise software companies, was seeking out the folks that had a lot of interest and a loud voice, not just with the power players, not just with the key stakeholders, but ones that commanded respect from their peers. Right? Because if I could get those people on board for whatever we were doing, they were more likely going to be able to pull everybody else with them.
Absolutely. One thing that I've always told my customers is, when they try to roll out a new initiative, is to select those people that are very strong. And by strength, I don't mean that they are the most powerful or the ones with a higher perceived power at the location. I mean it as the people that they will be welcoming the change and go through the whole change with an open mind, and be able to influence positively other locations that might be implementing this change, or other sets of the organization that will be having this change. Because when you don't have the right stakeholders, and that's why this exercise is so important, your project will really have a very hard time taking off. This stakeholder mapping allows you to understand who is there, and are you missing someone that might be key. It has happened. I mean, it has happened, I think, to all of us, that you might have one project out there that you don't even have the right people. Sometimes when you sign these big deals, you can have someone that is very high level. For example, they may bring the VPs and the CFOs, the CEOs, but they are not going to be the end users of your product. So while you have the voice of the people that financially can control or have a large budget impact, if you don't get the voice of the end user into your project, the people that will actually use your solution are not going to feel heard. And when they don't feel heard, they will resist it.
Yep, they'll resist it. They're not going to use it. Customer's not going to be able to get the value realized. This isn't about carrot versus stick. Stick, you need to use this. That's the wrong strategy. And what we would do when we would identify these people is we would over-index on support and on training for these folks. The whole point being they would help us drive adoption. But that's a good segue into now the how. So how do you recommend going about doing this activity? I mean, you talked about a couple of different tools.
Absolutely. Stakeholders are like personas. So you have to identify, out of these people that are involved, what level of influence they have. And again, if you are able to define work streams, that has worked for me, because I'm able to say, out of this pool of people, they care about these, or they might be subject matter experts on this particular area. And that's where I want to have them. But at the end of the day, in any initiative or project that you're rolling out or a program, you have to consider if you're meeting their needs. If you're not meeting the needs, do you just need to monitor how they're doing? Do you have to keep them informed? Do you have to manage them closely and understand where do they fit? If I go to the example of the CFO could be indifferent to the initiative. Is very common because they just want to they don't want to deal with the details. They just want to make sure that people are not going over budget, what was prescribed. And in this case, you might need the CFO to be agreeable with the direction the team takes, but not necessarily for him to be, or her to be enthusiastic or willing to help. So if you were to map that persona of the CFO, which is the person that is financially accountable to the project, and you put him as somebody that you have to manage closely, you will have him or her at the wrong level. You just need that person to be informed. That's what I want people to think. It's not, hey, all the CFOs go on this, because you might be rolling a financial solution. And if you're rolling a financial solution, probably the CFO should be much more involved.
Right.
So think about what your product or service is delivering, and then what level of engagement you need from that stakeholder. As you conduct that exercise and you think about whether you need to monitor them because they just need to stay close, you need to meet their needs, or you need to manage them closely. For example, people that have a loud voice into the project, you probably have to pay more attention to them. And lastly, those ones that have to keep informed. It's almost like a RACI that you're building,
I was just going to ask you that. Is this? Yeah. It sounds like a RACI diagram.
It's almost like a RACI, but the only thing the RACI does, it tells you what level of communication you have to have with them. In this case, the stakeholder matrix allows us to take that one step further, because it's not only what communication, but what level of engagement goes along with that communication. Where do you get them involved and where you do not? As an example, I had a very large project that we rolled out in 2020. And it was a very interesting project, at the time of the pandemic, where everybody's just thinking about, oh my God, what is going to happen? This customer took a brilliant opportunity to make a big change. One thing that we did was realize that we had to have the work streams, but at the end of the day, we needed the entire customer organization to be informed of what was going on. So for that, we developed the stakeholder matrix, and that positioned us to have different levels of communication. Sometimes it was communication that would just happen at a meeting level, meeting by meeting. And sometimes it was an internal, sort of like an external dashboard that will go out for those ones that just needed to keep informed on the progress.
And like you said, in any initiative for each persona, are you meeting their needs? How are you communicating with them? And then what level of engagement do you need with them?
Exactly.
Right? And like I said, where do you get them involved, and where do you just provide updates?
Yes. And look, there might be times where you have people at the wrong level, and you might need to change where you have them in the matrix. There are times that you could have people that are going to be affected, for example, the end user, and they might be very apprehensive around the initiative because it's going to change their jobs or their job description or the scope that they have. And that hesitation, if you have them very, very high into the engagement, the best thing for them would be perhaps to be a little bit more indifferent. That doesn't mean that they don't care, but they might be under a control route for them to not influence with their emotions the outcomes of the initiative. So it's very important to make sure that you're not only looking for higher engagement, sometimes you have to decrease the engagement that you have of some stakeholders.
Right. But I would also think that it would help you rationalize also the case for change and the what's in it for me for these individual people, which is so important when it comes to change management.
So important. And you're right. One of the things that one of my most successful projects I had was where we defined what's in it for me in partnership with the customer, because then you develop those personas and you were able to target them into the change management communication. Because not everybody cares about the same things. They have different roles in their organization, and being able to create those personas and manage them differently, because now you're dealing with what they care about, is critical for the success of your initiative.
Yeah, for sure. But now that being said, though, you still can approach this in a very scalable fashion, I would assume. You can have a standard, here's the standard set of personas that your solution typically works with. And while they may call them different names in different companies, and we need to personalize them for those different companies to make it very personal to them, this is something that you can use. You can create your own set of internal tools in a tool bag that you can apply, and maybe it differs by segment, size of your customer or even vertical, but you could still toolbox this thing and be able to apply this and have 70-80% of this stuff kind of laid out before you walk in, and be able to adjust it based on a customer's particular needs, wants, scope, and nomenclature.
100%. The only piece of caution that you have to have here is that when you develop that toolbox of personas, keep in mind that if you have different products that you're rolling out, the persona engagement might change. It might be the same persona, for example, the executive sponsor, but they might have a higher or a vested interest in that particular product that is going to differ the way that you engage with them. So absolutely, your personas, you can put them across your entire organization and your toolbox. Just be mindful that the products that you're selling or services that you're offering might differ, and they might want to be a little bit managed closely, as opposed to if it was something that they just need to be informed.
Yeah, well, just like with any tool, right? It's there as a starting point, but it's not going to be applied the exact same way in every situation. So you need to be smart enough and cognizant enough of the situation to understand that it's not just, I'm not just going to throw this tool at you generically. I've got to adjust based on what's happening.
Yes. So for those of you that are building teams, this is a great way to scale your teams, to have that in your toolbox. The only thing is just put that caveat that people need to understand the level of engagement required by product or service.
That all makes sense, and it's incredibly valuable. But let's change gears a little bit and talk about governance. Yes. Right. While governance might sound like a completely unrelated topic to stakeholder mapping, they very much are related, especially when it comes to change management. You need to understand your stakeholders, who they are, their roles, and their motivations, in order to help support the change that's going to happen. And that doesn't necessarily mean you as a vendor are going to be the one responsible for driving change. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't be responsible for driving change. You should be responsible for enabling change, but you need to understand how to enable change and what tools to provide in order to enable change most effectively. So to get started, let's establish what a governance body is for those listeners who are unfamiliar with the term.
This is a topic that I enjoy a lot, because people don't consider governance to be important until after the fact. So what is project governance? Governance provides direction and defines decision-making procedures and the metrics for validating the impacts to the project. These two are very important, but it also enables any team to deliver on requirements and creates a forum for issue resolution to occur in a timely manner. What do I mean by that? That if you don't have that body with your customer and yourself, then there are not expectations set. And it can be pretty chaotic because there is no understanding beforehand of how demand, issues, or decisions will be made.
Right. And customer success, a lot of what we do in customer success is all about expectation management, and it's about communication. And so this is a core component of customer success when you think about it even from a success plan perspective. I need to clearly define, what is success and how are we going to define when we've achieved it. Once again, the metrics, and then the approach, the procedures for achieving that success. So who would you see being enlisted in this type of body?
Well, the first person I always include is executive sponsors on both sides. You have to have a sponsor on your side, meaning somebody at a higher level that is representing your organization. And then you have to have the customer. Typically, that's the person that made the decision to go with your solution. So those two will be the first ones I will pair. And then you will have your team, which usually will include somebody from the onboarding. If you're going through an onboarding phase, you will include some of those teams that are going to help get the customer live or into your solution. And then on the customer side, you basically have, it's almost like a mirror of what you have on your side and what you have in theirs. That's like a steering committee that they have. It's a team also guiding how the solution will be used, how it will be implemented. And then lastly, and this is more of bottoms up, the other team that I include is that working group. These super users or people that they have identified as people that will have a significant input into how the end user will take your products or services. I have defined it this way with us here at Burst Street for the reason that sometimes the person that, like I said earlier, signs the contract might not be the end user. And if you don't take the working group, then you are removing a very critical element that will create resistance and will later on deem your product or service not to be successful because it doesn't adapt to what they need. So all these stakeholders that you put into a governance body, they need to know exactly what you are doing in partnership with them. But what I've told my customers is that developing this body is not just at the beginning. It's not just while you're going through an onboarding phase. The idea is that these people will go with you throughout. They will see your product or service be rolled out and then remain in there as the people that help you manage any demand that comes down the line. There might be changes to your product or services or additions that require consensus. They also help you manage the issues and the priorities because sometimes the field might bring issues that contradict the end goal of your project. And lastly, that they stay for sustainment. They have so much that they have learned throughout.
I think it's important to highlight how important the importance of the super users. This governance committee isn't all, it's not about leadership. I mean, it's about leadership. You want your key stakeholders on there, you want your decision makers, but it's so important to have those boots on the ground end users, people who are going to be using the product every single day, using your service every single day. I don't want the team lead of a group that's going to be using something that we have to offer. I want the people who are actually going to be using it on a daily basis. I want them represented, even more so sometimes than the team leads or the executive sponsor, because those people are a lot farther away from the daily usage. And if we nail it with those personas, if we nail it with those people, then we are going to have a lot more success in driving adoption.
And that I wouldn't necessarily say that I will exclude them because obviously some decisions do need a higher degree of understanding of how as a whole the organization might be leveraging your products or services or the end goal that they might have.
Yep.
But I will say that's why you create those personas, because in this state, in this committee that you're creating or this governance structure that you're building, when you communicate to the executive sponsor, it's going to be very different what he or she cares about the status of the initiative as opposed to the working teams. With the working teams, you're basically rolling sleeves and saying, how are we going to do this? How do we roll out? What does it make sense? What decisions need to be made? With the steering committee, it's more about saying these decisions that you're asking will have X or Y impact. What is your concern? Should we do this across the board? Should we look at regional standardization? Should we look at vertical standardization? There are a myriad of decisions that the working group might be pushing because they have a different interest they might be pushing for, but they're not seeing the whole picture. So you have to take the SMEs, they're going to be the end users. How does those decisions affect the overall goal of the initiative? That's your steering committee. And then the executive sponsors, they care about, are we going to be on time? Are we going to be on budget? Are we going to be with quality? What is the perceived satisfaction of this project? Are we going to hit those KPIs that we set at the beginning? That's what they care about. And your communication with each of those groups is going to be different. But from my perspective, when I roll out an initiative or a big project with a customer and they don't have a governance body, it is not successful. And be mindful that they could put too many people into a governance body, and that's too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yep. Well, just because you have a governance body, I don't want to scare people. Governance body doesn't necessarily, to your point, doesn't have to be huge, right? But the key is, you talk about the executive sponsor is interested in, are we hitting the budget? Are the users satisfied? Are we getting value out of this thing? Right. So, of course, the executives need to be represented, the decision makers need to be represented. But what's the best way to ensure that we're hitting those metrics? It's the same thing that we talk about in delivering customer success. Let's focus on the leading indicators. And the leading indicators in this case are your end users. If we're giving the end users what they need, if we are helping them understand what's in it for them, and if we are delivering, we are delivering value to them each individually, that's going to bubble up. And that's going to have an effect on the KPIs that the key decision makers, the executive stakeholder, care about.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. It's not easy, but it's also not so difficult that it's impossible. I will tell you what makes it very difficult when you don't have alignment with your customer. And that's your goal. Customer success, we drive through value and impact. What impact are we making? What value are we bringing? So it's not impossible, but I will tell you that when there is no governance, you have chaos, for sure.
And using tools like, once again, stakeholder mapping, and a governance body where everything's kind of laid out drives alignment. We've got something to look at. We got something to agree with or disagree with and have a conversation on.
Yes, yes. From my perspective, the biggest outcome that I get out of the governance body is during the onboarding is to develop a blueprint. We both have agreed on what we are going to get out of it and how we're going to measure it. That's our blueprint. The second piece I get from there are lessons learned. That project retrospective. This is what we set out to do, and this is what we actually did. I've done this only with very large programs that I've personally been involved in, but I will tell you that that retrospective allows you sometimes to tweak your strategy if you went into a smaller wave or smaller set of locations where we are implementing, and then it allows you to tweak the strategy and then be more successful large scale. And lastly, to strengthen the relationship. You really build a team that is going to be with you and understand and appreciate how you arrive at the decisions that were made in order for your solution or product to be used in a specific way.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of retrospectives. They could be large formal exercises, or they could just be you sitting around with your team members going, okay, what did we do right there? What did we not do right?
Exactly.
Right. But looking back and figuring out what we did well that we could capitalize on, or what did we not do well, and are there ways that we can do it differently, is incredibly important. It's a tenet for customer success, right? We talk about how important it is that customer success is this kind of living, breathing thing. We should always be looking to evolve it, to improve it. Very, very few companies have reached a maturity level in customer success, and I mean very few have reached a maturity level where they're like, okay, we're done. Right. This is all we're going to do, because everything that happens in your world, whether it's with your product, with the growth of your company, with your customer base, the way they evolve, you're going into new verticals, or they're maturing, they're better understanding of your product. Everything kind of dictates you taking a look at, is there something that we can do better? And usually there is. There usually is something that you can find that you can use to improve, to tweak, fine tune how you deliver success.
Absolutely. Always question the status quo. There's always opportunities for
always question the status quo. Love that. That's a great way to kind of wrap things up here. Always question the status quo. Awesome. Karla, thank you once again for your time yet again with me. I do appreciate it, and I'm sure the listeners will appreciate it as well. And hopefully we can do this again soon.
Absolutely. Happy to. Thank you for having me.